All right, welcome to today's video. Today we're going to take a brief look at JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation. So we'll get started here. What is JSON? Well, as I mentioned here, JavaScript Object Notation. The primary purpose as a web developer is to use this for the storing and exchange of data. And so oftentimes you'll see as you start to develop more robust applications that we've been looking at throughout the course kind of a standard model. That is that our applications generate requests to the server then processes some server-side code. It processes, for our application examples, the PHP, and then it returns a result or a response that contains all the markup. What JSON, what we can do is we can work with APIs or web services, and that on the client-side code we can generate a request that instead of having to parse a bunch of PHP, what it can do then is request data. The application can send that back in a format, a data format like JSON, and then the client side can parse that data and update the user interface based off of that data that was returned. And so it's a relatively common format. You'll see that a lot of times if you start working with third-party services like Twitter feeds or Facebook timelines or something like that, and that you will request data from their service. The data will return to you in JSON or XML or something. You'll parse that on the client side using your JavaScript and then dynamically update that user interface. There's a definite trend in application development to do more client side. If you take a look at, and yet again, there's to kind of as a testament to how broad this field really is, AngularJS is a very neat or becoming a very popular framework for developing a lot of JavaScript, in which case you may find yourself consuming some data from an API in the form of JSON. Definitely, again, worth taking the time to look at this if you're interested in doing more development with the web application spectrum, but just something, we simply don't have time to learn. So we want to exchange data, and that really kind of comes down to the core of why we learn JSON. We typically use it with a web service, and that we're exchanging data, and then we're doing something on the client side to update the response from that. What is XML? Well, XML is another format. It's very similar in that it's a way to exchange data. And it's kind of been the standard for quite a while now, and you're seeing a definite trend for most developers to prefer JSON. I prefer JSON. I think it's easier to work with. It's easier to parse versus XML. This slide here shows us an example. This top part here is JSON, and we'll go through exactly how to read this. Bottom part here is XML. And what you'll notice with XML is that it looks a lot like the HTML that we write. That is, everything is nested hierarchically within tags. So let's say that we have this parentmost tag being employees. That then indicates that we have a collection of, and you can see inside of here, then that first sibling to that employee's parent is employee. So you can see we have 1, 2, 3 employees. And then employees have properties. They have data about that employee. First name, last name. And so that's how we encapsulate that data using an XML document. JSON, very similar. We have employees, the square brackets here, just like they do with regular JavaScript, indicates that it's an array. So we have a collection of objects. That's what the curly brackets denote here, is that we have objects. Those objects then have properties, key value pair properties. This is the name of the property, colon, and then this is the value. So if this is a collection of employees, we have 3 employees, and those are 3 objects, and they have 2 properties each, first name and last name. And we'll go through the JSON here. We're not going to go through XML. If you have to parse XML at some point in time, or if you have, most frameworks, most languages have something in their libraries to help you parse that, just like we have with JSON. Let's see, what's the difference? Well, it really boils down to oftentimes what you prefer as a developer, what that third-party service is providing you. Not all third-party services, not all data can you choose the format. Some might just return XML. I've recently worked on a project in which case I was interacting with an API, I was interacting with that third-party web service, sending requests to an application, getting a response back, and all they would return to me is XML. So I had to work with XML. When given the choice, though, then you can choose. And as I mentioned, I typically choose JSON. Why I choose JSON, as I mentioned, it's easier to parse, easier to read. It's built into JavaScript. And so the syntax that you're going to look at, the more you do JavaScript, the more you'll see this JSON object notation be used throughout all of your code that you write with JavaScript. And so it becomes much easier. It's part of JavaScript. You don't need a parser with XML. You typically need an additional library, some additional functionality in order to parse that XML. You can use arrays. You don't have to worry about the tag pairs. And then we have this JSON.parse method that we'll look at here in just a moment, which makes it a little bit easier. So the data format, talked about that a little bit, and that the data itself then is going to be properties of an object. They're going to be stored in key value pairs. And so we have a relatively straightforward way of saying this is the property name, this is the key, and this is the data that it holds, or the value. They will be separated by commas. Right? You can see here that these properties are separated by commas. And the curly braces are what hold those objects. Square brackets hold the array. And so once you understand this is the basics behind JSON, this is how you structure those JSON objects, it becomes very straightforward because there isn't a whole lot you need to learn. You need to learn the curly brackets, the square brackets, and then the key value pair of the data, and then you're done. Values can be numbers, strings, booleans, arrays, and other objects. And so we're working with the basic JavaScript data types. What does an object look like? We looked at it very briefly there in that first example. Curly brackets. Curly brackets then denote that this is an object. So if we look at this line right here, we'd have an object that would have two properties, property and property 2, and the values would simply be value. Arrays, much like arrays in just normal JavaScript, because again, this is just normal JavaScript, are denoted using the square brackets. And so if we have a square bracket and then another square bracket, these become elements in that array. We use commas to separate those elements, just like we do with a normal array. The only difference here is that the value for this element, element 0, element 1, or element 1, element 2, index 0, index 1, they happen to be objects. These objects then have properties, name and address, right? So with this is a key value pair. This is a property on this object. You can see that this property is called employees, and its value is an array of other objects. Right? And so that's how we start to combine the arrays, the objects, and the properties into a JSON document, JSON response, in order to send data back and forth. So again, once you understand the array, the property, and the object notation, it becomes very straightforward, relatively easy to work with. We'll look at two methods in which we can work with JSON. The one is that we have an actual JSON object, in which case we don't have to do any parsing. The other is how do we parse a JSON string. And so oftentimes when you work with an API or a web service, the data that it returns will be a JSON response, but it'll be a string value. And so you'll have to parse that string value in order to turn it into an actual JSON JavaScript object. All right, so that's the slides. I have an example that I've uploaded to our class folder under JavaScript. The file here, this is what it looks like. And so relatively straightforward document. We have most of what we're going to be focusing on is inside of that script tag. And down here we have a button that calls the load JSON function, and then just some text here, a div with an h2, and we'll modify that here in just a little bit. As far as the function, this is the function that we're going to call. And inside of here, to begin with, all I'm going to do is use the JavaScript object notation to define this object users, and then we'll print that off in the console. We'll see what that looks like. So users is pointing to curly bracket, right? So it's an array. Inside of that array, it has 3 objects, right? Because we're using those curly brackets to define an object. So each object has 2 properties, a username and a password. And so we can load this page and call this function and just log that user array to the console, and that'll show us what that object looks like. All right, so let's go ahead. I'm going to refresh, load JSON, and you can see here this is the output that my developer tools gives me. It says I said to log the user's object. right here. Right? And it's telling me then that that is an array, and inside that array, it contains 3 objects. And so we can click on any of those objects, and you can see here are the properties, password and username, and those are the values, password and username. And so we can log that JSON object to the console, and then we can interact with it. The proto stuff here you can ignore. That's just information that JavaScript uses. So what we're focused on is that array and those objects. How do we access those? Well, we can go down here, and I'm going to go ahead and comment out this little bit of code. And so what this is going to do then is we have a result variable. Okay, I'm going to get rid of the console.log. I don't need that at this point in time. I have a result variable, and we're going to go through, because this is an array, so we'll just set up a standard for loop and go through every element in that array. Inside of the loop then, we'll concatenate to that result variable some hard-coded string values, username, password, and then we'll access each object in that array, each element of that array, and then we can just use dot and then property name to get the value. So username is a property, password is a property, and that will give us access to that value. So when this is done, what this should print off then is the 3 values, username, password, and the appropriate value for those properties. All right, so we'll go ahead, I will refresh. Oh, syntax error. Expected expression got an asterisk, so that means I've got a, there we go, comment character there that was trailing. So refresh again, click the button, and there we go. Username, 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 password, password, password. Right, so we got that array, we iterated over that collection, and then we updated the output there with those appropriate property values. All right, now I mentioned that sometimes you may get JSON back, and that JSON is in this format of a string. And so let's say that we have the JSON string here. Right, this is all a string value. Okay, I'm just doing concatenation. The only reason that I've broken this up onto multiple lines is just to make it a little bit easier to see. Right here, you can see the difference. That up here, square bracket, curly bracket, right? That's not enclosed with double or single quotes. That is being interpreted directly as JavaScript. But down here, I'm putting it all in single quotes. And so this whole entire value here is being treated as a string. And we can double check that. Okay, I can say console.log JSON string. And let's hold off on running through that loop for now. Go back and refresh the page. And you can see it's not an object. It's not letting me interact with this as an object because it is a string. And so it's just one big string value. So if you work with a service that returns that as a string, then you have a method called JSON.parse. And what JSON.parse will do is it will obviously parse that into JSON. See, and now we can add this code back in. We can have our loop, and that will take that string response, take that string value from JSON string, parse it into a JSON object, which is now our user's variable like we had before, and then because that parses is the same exact thing, that parses it into an array that is a collection of objects, it'll work just like it did before. And so I can say load JSON, there's the results, there's our array and our object, and everything worked as we had hoped. All right, let's see here. Okay, so sorry for the interruption there. Again, what we're going to do here, I just wanted to provide one relatively straightforward or maybe more practical or real-world example. There is a website available that provides an API service that generates random users. It's called RandomUserMe, and this works great because it's a free API for generating random user data, kind of like the lorem ipsum if you run across that. How we can work with that and what it returns is this JSON. And so you can see that if you look at this JSON, while it may look relatively daunting, it's relatively straightforward. The JSON itself starts with a curly bracket. That means that this is an object. This is a property then. So we have a results property. Inside of there you can see that it is an array, and inside of that array then it contains an object. So that object has properties. One of the properties is user. The value is another object. That has gender, that has name, name's another object, title first and last. And so what we can do is we can go through this response. We can understand what's the array, what are the properties, what are the objects, and we can pull information out with it. I've developed, we're not going to go through this one, but I've developed a similar just sample application here. Again, it's going to look a little bit nicer in that we can add a user. And every time we click the button, this is going to generate an AJAX request to their API to get a random user. And then that's just adding in this user to this page. Right? It doesn't look bad. It's all relatively straightforward information, but it's coming from their API. So with our example then, to kind of pick up where we left off, what I did was I created another function called GetUsers. And we'll just have load.json call that function, so we don't have to change too much with our document here. So they'll click the button, call GetUsers, and GetUsers will have an AJAX request. That's the AJAX request that's just standard. It's almost boilerplate out of our AJAX document. So we looked at that earlier in the semester. And inside of here, then, the only thing that I had to change was the fact that we're now making a request to api.randomuser.me. And so once this executes and we get a response, we're going to log to the console xml.http.response_text. And so we'll go back now to our file and we'll refresh the page and click load, and there you see, there's that response. Now, just like our previous example here, this is all in text. This is a string value. We see it as a string result. We can't interact with any of it. JavaScript is not telling us that it's an object or an array or anything along those lines. And so in order to work with that response, what we need to do is we need to say, let's create a variable, call it user, and we'll say json.parse xml http.response text. Okay, and now from there I'll change the console.log to user. And I'll go back and refresh, load the JSON, and now you can see that the result was returned was an object. And that's exactly what we expected. Go back to the random user to look at their documentation. They say that they're going to return an object that contains these properties. We look at our results in console, we have an object that contains these properties. So, first property, results. We look at the result, we can select that array. We have an object. All right, here's our user. So go back here, inside of the results array, we have an object. One of the properties is user. So just like we're seeing in our developer tools, now we can expand the user, and now that is where we find all of this information. You can see that they've nested it. And so all of these properties belong to this user object, right? There are information, gender, email, location, name, right? Whatever we want to pull out. And so like that example that we just looked at, what my application was doing was it was generating an AJAX request to their API. It was getting this response user, and then it was simply accessing those values in order to pull particular properties out. And so let's say that we just simply want to log to the console. Let's see, what do we got? Say that we want to log the first name and the last name. So we have to look at this object to understand. We have an object. Results is an array. So we would say user.results at 0 dot user dot name dot first. Let's see if I got it right. Ricardo, right? So that gave us, following whether these are objects or arrays, to drill down into the properties and get first and last. And now every time we click this button, we get a new object that's returned. Ricardo, Karsten, Leo, and what have you there. Right? So that's how we drilled into that. You're not sure? Well, you get a JSON response back, log it to the console, and see what it looks like. Right, here's an object, it's an array, and now we can drill into those properties from there. Look at the documentation. Most websites that are going to provide as an API their data, or your ability to interact with it, are going to provide you with documentation as well, which is what we have here, right? So in order to read this, you have to understand the basics of JSON. You have to understand property values, arrays, and objects, and then you'll understand how to read JSON. And now, just like in this example, and that little bit more robust one here that I've showed you earlier, this one just looks a little bit nicer. Once you understand how to do that, it's very easy to request data from a service. Pretend this was Twitter and you were just getting the latest tweets from a user account. You could request those from Twitter. Twitter would return them in a JSON format. You could update the interface dynamically on the client side, using all of it using JavaScript to get those latest tweets from a different user. So let's see. I think that's it. Introduction to JSON. So again, like kind of most of the material throughout the semester, and especially going into this last week, I just wanted to give you a basic idea of how it works. In order to really understand it, try to work through the example here. Take the sample code. I'll make sure to save this to our folder. Play around with it. Maybe try to generate something that looks a little bit more like this. I realize we're at the end of the semester though, so here are some things available for you to work on as you're moving forward. You will, if you continue to work on web development, websites, you will find yourself exchanging data. And you can use JSON. I don't want to confuse you with the fact that JSON isn't just available for web applications. JSON is becoming a very popular format for data exchange with a variety of languages. And so it's something that's good to get familiar with and somewhat comfortable with. So let's see, I think that's it. So let me know if you have any questions on JSON.